Jerry DiPiano from FemPharma Consumer Healthcare and the Love Me Avita podcast. But today we are doing a webinar and we are very happy to have all of our guests and participants join us. Today's guest is Dr. Juliana Hauser, who is a sexpert. Dr. Juliana leads conversations about relationships, agencies, sexuality, intimacy, and so much more. She is an expert in intimacy, but she's also a professional, and she makes this conversation a lot of fun. Professionally, Dr. Juliana received her PhD in counseling education from the College of William and Mary. She's considered a thought leader and a sexpert, as indicated previously. She dives deep into the hard-to-have conversations that we all need to be having. She spent decades counseling and supporting thousands of individuals and partners on their paths to discover their sexual agency, relationship intimacy, and fulfilling sexual connection. The jewel of Dr. Juliana's offering is something called the Revealed course, so you ought to check it out. She also certifies others to facilitate the same course in 8 countries. At the end of this webinar, I would encourage you to check out drjuliana.com and learn more about her and the ways in which she might work with you, or the ways in which you might learn more from her to become your own sexpert. Dr. Juliana, welcome to the FemPharma Love Me Avita webinar. And today we are going to talk about a unifying topic. So we're going to take a break from the midterm election results, oh my, and discuss the unifying topic of sex and better relationships through better communication using something called sex positivity.
I'm so happy to be here and having this conversation with you today.
Likewise. So Juliana and I have had many conversations. She's a regular guest on the Love Me Avita podcast. If you haven't listened to it, check her out on our Love Me Avita podcast. We talk about a lot of sex. There's a lot of talk going on. And we do delve into some of the more thorny topics, if you will, about sex, sexuality, how to improve sex, how to feel more comfortable with sex. But today, talking about sex positivity, I guess I thought about sex as being positive, but perhaps that's coming from my own bias as opposed to being sex negative. So for those that haven't heard about sex positivity, what is it?
So I'll start with a lot of us, if we were given any kind of sex education, it was not based in sex positivity. So our education was fear-based. It was all the things that could go wrong or bad, and it was not pleasure-focused. So that's what sex positivity isn't, and that's a lot of us were given that. And if we were lucky, we had people who were sex positive in our lives, or we had access to sex positive literature through books or conversations. And basically, like what we're talking about is that the belief that people should have the space and access to, and with judgment free and without shame, like learning about what their sexuality is, all of it. And for me, when I talk about sexuality, it is a holistic lens that we're looking at sex positivity and a sexual definition. It's also that you believe in pleasure, that you believe in consent, you believe that sexuality is healthy and it is normal and it is something that we should be curious about. And I add to like that definition, it's something that should be a priority in your life, something that isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. That's sex positivity to me.
You know, I remember at the age of 16, I don't want any of my family members to listen to this thinking that that sex was definitely a priority.
Yes.
And it's interesting that over time, some of our cultural biases, some of our ethnic biases, some of the religious biases enter the picture and kind of change that for us. And that's where, at least my understanding of the whole sex negativity comes into play, because we are creatures of evolution from our own families and from our churches and synagogues and temples and so forth. And it's not that they aren't well-meaning, but a lot of this becomes a morality play, and that those sorts of messages remain with us. And then sex may feel dirty or uncomfortable or somehow only for procreation. So is sex negativity really all of those things kind of wrapped up in one, or are there other things that play into sex negativity that we ought to be wary of? So when we do our inventory, if you will, are there things that we ought to be have self-awareness of?
There are three things that I think are common when there's a sex negative space. One is there is judgment, which means there's a right and a wrong of sexuality. Again, under the umbrella of holistic sexuality, but it is, I know the right way to have a sex life, to have your sexuality, and your way is not it. That is incorrect. And so a judgment, right and wrong. Another is that shame. If there is shame present, then there has been sex negativity in there. And some of that is inherent in our culture. Some of it is we haven't done a great job of helping people heal from things that have happened to them. Or, and I'm not even talking about like the bigger aspects of sexual violence, but actually I'm talking about the more insidious things that happen, that it's a comment that's made here and there. It's a negative experience that you've had that you make meaning of. It's a media message that you saw that feels related to you or personal to you. It is the overhearing those conversations that don't match what you think you know of yourself in a sexual place. The other thing is the absence of sexual agency. So the absence of having the ability to decide what your sexuality is on your own terms, to know what you need and what you want, to know what your expression is and your access to all of that.
You know, folks that may be listening to this webinar, watching the two of us, probably thinking, okay, well, there's a silver sister there, and then there's this young woman, Dr. Juliana, and the silver sister probably remembers the whole sexual liberation movement. I was a little young to be sexually liberated when the sexual liberation movement came to be, but I certainly remember free love, love the one you're with. How is that different from sex positivity? Because at least at that point, it appeared from someone who was pretty young looking in, and then as I matured, it appeared that we were talking about comfort with sexuality and comfort with having sex. And because of the advent of contraception, women felt safer expressing themselves sexually with their partners.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a great positivity.
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think it's not necessarily either or. I think it's more of a both and in a way, but there are some differences when you're really looking at sexual liberation. It's a state of mind, it's a philosophy, frankly, it was an era also that believed in removing anything that was inhibiting access to sexuality. And to me, it was a really a pervasive entry point to sexual agency of like, so what do you want? And that was really one of the first questions that times that you really saw a whole generation asking that. So that's wonderful. So there's the sex positivity that's coming into it. I think when I've talked to those who were really sexually active during this phase of our country in particular, There was also a lack of agency too that was a part of it. There was a lack of like purpose and intention. And sex positivity has purpose and intention as a part of it. Sexual liberation, in general, kind of was described more as like the more the better, the variety the better, you do you, all that kind of stuff, and trying and experimenting. And I think there's a lot that's great about that. But not when there's an absence of purpose and intention of what you're saying yes to and what you're saying no to. I've never ever equated sexual activity or the number or what you're doing with positive or negative. It is all about were you authentically asking yourself, and did you have space to say yes or no freely? Either space that you gave yourself or space that your partners, or an era was given you.
And you said something about partner and partners, and for those that don't have a partner, that they may be abstaining from intercourse, not because they necessarily want to, but because it's just a fact of life at this particular phase of life. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they lack sex positivity. They can still have sex positivity, even if they are not in a relationship with someone other than themselves.
Which is the most important relationship to have. Your most important sexual partner is you. And it's interesting. So Betty Dotson, who passed away 2 years ago, recently, actually her anniversary death date was a couple days ago. She was really a pioneer of self-pleasure, and she died at 91 and was really in the liberation movement and was in the feminist movement, and found in that too, she'll say that she was described as the sexual pioneer of self-pleasure. And even back then, like in the 70s, it was very different to have someone saying the most liberating thing you can do is have self-pleasure and be your own sex advocate. And she was well ahead of the curve, and was shunned from a lot of people because of that. And now it's so beautiful that we can own that and understand that it's a way to know your body. It's a way to have agency, and it's just the most important sex positive relationship you can have.
And when we start making judgments about those kinds of things, so as some folks may remember, there was the conversation about going blind if one masturbated.
Hairy palms was another one.
Yes, I recall hearing folks, mostly younger friends of mine, describe what might happen about going blind, or getting the hairy palm, or being denied pleasure at some further point in life. And those are the kinds of cultural biases that sort of remain with us, that may help us in some ways to think about how to overcome that sexual negativity. Once we know that that's where this emanated from, then we have the opportunity to do something about it, right? Because we know that none of that happens. I don't know that there's been one documented case. But when we have those cultural, religious, or other influences that may have predisposed us to sexual negativity, it really is important for us to take that kind of inventory. Remember, these were just myths. These were fairy tales, and we have to find ways to dispel those. And then it comes down to couples, right? So let's say you found your person. You figured out how to have self-pleasure, and you are in a different place, perhaps, than the person that you're partnering with. So what happens when couples work on sex positivity, and perhaps they are coming at it from very different places?
I want to go back to the first point you're making of just the myths that came to be to control, especially children or young adults, into not having sexual pleasure. And that carries forth a little bit into the couples too that I work with as well. Like, we have a lot of messages. It is impossible to get to adulthood without hearing or being exposed to messages about self-pleasure just in general. And it's interesting, like so interesting to me is, why was that something that needed to be controlled? What was so scary about something that's natural and something that they've seen even like in utero, that they have had infants that are touching themselves, and experiencing pleasure, or it looks like they're experiencing pleasure. Why are we so afraid of it? What do they think the consequences are going to be to it? And I'm asked that question quite a bit too, and even in the context of couples, which is it, does it stoke the fire to have self-pleasure, or does it take away sexual energy, especially if you do have someone that you're partnered with? Which is it? And I'm not sure why it has to be both. Why it can't be both? Why does it have to be one or the other? But my belief of self-pleasure, whether it's children or young adults, is that it's a really crucial part of getting to know your body, and it's a really crucial thing to remove those negative messages. I think it's one of the most common and one of the first messages about sexuality that people see and experience, which is, this is bad. So if you have a natural urge, or you've discovered something about your body feels good, and then you are told something bad can happen, or you were bad for doing it, it seeps into so much of your body, your cells, and frankly, your neural pathways. So I have this exercise that I do, and we, of course, we start with sexual pleasure and self-pleasure. I do this if you're an individual, or if you're partnered, and I call it decluttering. So it's similar that you would do to like a closet, and we go through a list of sexual messages. We start with the negative ones, like what did you receive about this? What are you holding on to? What are the things that you've seen get away between what you want in your sexual relationship and what you have? And sometimes there's a variety of things, or something unique to your particular sexual journey. But in general, it's about your body. It's about your genitals. It's about self-pleasure. It's about when is the good time, the right time to be sexually active. What is losing your virginity versus having a sexual debut? Like, so we look at all the messages that you got. And we look at, where did they come from? Media, religion, family of origin, friend base, that one movie reel you had in health class. What were the things that doctor that said something to you? Where were the sources of all these sexual messages? And then we look at it, and I put them into three categories, or the person puts it into three categories, which is, you're going to keep them, you're going to tweak them, and you're going to trash them. So where do those sexual messages go? And how you make the decision is in the context of, what do I want my sex positive life to be now and moving forward? And we go through, once, especially when we figure out the ones that we're going to trash, we actively trash them. We actively say, this isn't my belief system. This is not my values. And this is not going to serve the relationship I want with my sexuality now or moving forward. For those that we keep, that's an easy category also. And we herald it, and we say, like, do you want to know more information about this? Or have more of a community of support around them. For the category that's tweaking, that takes more time. And so what about this doesn't fit? There may be something that feels right, but not all of it. What do we need to tweak in order it to feel like something you want to carry forward into your sexual life, and that feels sex positive on your terms?
To me, a non-psychologist, it sounds like those individuals that are coming to you have already made the decision that sex positivity and better communication is already super important, or they wouldn't spend the time. They're making an investment. They're taking time. They want to work with a professional. But I'm sure there are folks that are listening here and watching, and they're saying to themselves, yes, but I'm not sure. Instead of yes, and it's yes, but, right? So shutting things down. I'm not sure I'm ready for this, but I need to have better communication, and I need to find ways in which to work on this with my partner. What can someone do just from their home base, without the benefit of using someone with your skill set? Are there some techniques that can help with that communication with your partner?
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I would say, like, in that category that you're speaking of, I typically hear, my marriage or my relationship is going to end if we don't fix this. And there'll usually be like a time frame. We haven't had sex in this length of time, or my partner has had it, and or I've had it, and like it's not necessarily that they're wanting to be sex positive. They're nervous that this is the canary in the mine, or they've had it. And the other thing is that or like I feel broken and I don't think it should feel this way. So what do I do? And I'm not sure that is an obvious link to sex positivity too, but I hear it quite a bit. So what do you do on your own? I think that exercise is something that you can do on your own also, that you can just start examining and looking at it. One of the things that is such a problem in the ripple effect of a lack of sex education that's based in pleasure and based in sex positivity is that we don't have the language for it. We don't have the language for these things, and how to have these conversations, and we don't have the questions to ask. Like, how do you know what you don't know? And where do we get those questions? And how do we start feeling comfortable with having those words come out of our mouth, or out for someone else to witness? And so it is checking in with sexual values, checking in with what your journey was. I think one of the best things you can do on your own is really understanding in your childhood, like up until like through like your high school age, what did you learn? Positive, negative, good, bad, about anything that has to do with a sexual life. So about sensuality, about your body, about health and reproduction, and just start putting words to it imperfectly and looking at what your comfort level is with that. I think that's one exercise that you can do on your own. Another is one that you and I have spoken about before, that is a way to look at what you want and don't want. And I find it to be one of the best first acts of agency, of like knowing what you need and what you want in your own terms. But a lot of people walk into adulthood or well into their adulthood and don't know particularly how to answer, is this a yes or a no for me? And the way that you go about this is a very simple exercise to put into place, not necessarily simple to follow through with, is you get a long list of sex acts. It's really easy to Google that on the internet, and you put 2 lines on a piece of paper, one that's horizontal, one that's vertical, and one that's horizontal, and you have 4 quadrants. One is sex acts that you've done that you want to do again. The second one is sex acts that you've done that you don't think you want to do again. Third is sex acts you haven't done that you don't want to do again. And the fourth is sex acts that you haven't done that you think you want to try. And what to me, why that exercise, you can do it alone, and without professional help, is a wonderful beginning ground, because it's not necessarily what you answer, because I think that actually is a place that is really helpful for a professional to come in, but it's the process of determining this is a yes or a no. And what is that like for you? And really it's a diagnostic of how comfortable are you with saying yes or no in your life and knowing what you need and want. And I think that is a very valuable place to to assess yourself. And then you can bring that if you ever wanted to invite a professional into the conversation. And both exercises you can do solo or if you're partnered.
Those are really great pieces of advice. And I'm not sure that we do that often enough, right? So what makes me feel comfortable may not be the same thing that makes my partner feel comfortable. And knowing that can make it difficult to want to be have sex positivity, because if one of us is shy about doing something or uncomfortable or feels that it's coercive, then that's not okay. And I know that at least it's one of the components of having sexual positivity or sex positivity is that this has to be non-coercive. So both parties need to feel super comfortable with this, and not judge the other party if one member is not completely comfortable. It may be that that's not going to happen, and that is something that is excluded from your repertoire of sex acts, right? But we need to do that inventory. If I'm understanding you correctly, this is something you can do without necessarily having the benefit of someone like yourself who is a professional. What are your thoughts about? I'm a big believer in reading about anything. So research Research
I love it about you. You're a great researcher.
research is what I do, and research is where I go when I want to solve problems. And it's looking to whether it is the scientific literature or whether it's a great textbook, or I know it sounds pretty dry in terms of reading material, but there's some good resources for individuals who may not want to or can't afford to engage a psychologist. Are there some things that you can recommend in terms of reading, self-help, some literature that you could point our listeners and viewers to?
Well, and some of that depends on really where you land on the continuum of sexuality. So I would get very clear about where your what you know about yourself and your identity, what you know about yourself, about what feels right, and your expression to sexuality. But we're so fortunate that we are living in an era where there's a lot of articles, there's a lot of things online that you can look at in the privacy of your own home or phone and put a topic in, and there'll be a plethora of places in which to do so. And there are also they're like versions of like Netflix, but there's sex education platforms out there as well, that then you pay for a monthly membership, and then you can get access to information about it. And I can give you links to the ones that I recommend and that I've had my own experience with. None of it that I'm affiliated with professionally, like paid for wise, but ones that I recommend to people that I work with. And go from there. I also like to encourage people to find journalists who are writing about. So if you find one article that really hits you, that is really interesting to you, follow that journalist and look for other articles that person is writing. I think that makes a big difference too, and that you can learn more in that aspect. And then there's often still, even though Facebook for some ages is not very vibrant, there's still a lot of groups out there, and there could be like a group chat that you find on just a general Google search, or within Facebook, you can put the topic that you're interested in knowing more about, and there will invariably be a group that is open to it and finding things out about it.
I'll put in a plug for an app, and we actually know the CEO. We're happy to support other women-owned businesses, and especially women-owned businesses like Get Rosie, the Get Rosie app. So that would be another resource that women may want to consider. And again, we're very supportive of the sort of work that they do. It's very good work. Their CEO is actually a very strong woman leader position. So I'll put in a plug for Get Rosie, the Get Rosie app, ROSY. And
Oh, sorry.
no, it's totally fine. But there are definitely journalists that we have followed here at FemPharma. We do our own blog, as you know, and so you may find some articles on our blog. Listen to our podcast. Dr. Juliana, as I said, is a featured guest. We work with Juliana extensively. We continue to find her extremely knowledgeable, helpful, and very comfortable. So if you want to learn more about her, you can certainly listen to our other podcasts featuring Dr. Juliana.
Let me put a plug in too, like for two in particular, since you did two. OMG Yes is an organization that's associated with the Kinsey Institute. It is more focused on those who have vulvas, but it is done very, very well. So if you have a vulva or you have a sexual connection with someone who has a vulva, it is done very well. And the Kinsey Institute is something that is really, it's an institute that's highly viewed in scientific research for sexuality issues. I also like an organization called now it's called Hello Revel. Do you know them? They were the Wolfers. Anita Collins is the person who began it, and it's a really robust community. They've just bought out by Hello Revel, and they have an app, and they have robust articles too, and a website, and they are focused on those who are over 40, but there's a lot of emphasis on diversity of sexuality. And so I found there to be a lot of good experts there, a lot of people who are speaking about it. They even have, like, every Monday night, there is a topic that's related to sexuality that they're speaking to that you can be a part of if you're in their community. And there's lots of places like that too.
I'm glad that you brought up diversity and sexuality and diversity in general, because that's a key component of sex positivity. We talk about the no judgment zone. We talk about no judgment in terms of sexual diversity, in terms of sexual diversity, in terms of proclivities. So different sex acts that are pleasurable to one person should not be judged as being kinky or weird or somehow strange or abnormal. And that's part of the non-judgmental, the breadth of sexual diversity. And until we have that acceptance and non-judgmental point of view, it makes it really hard to really fully embrace sex positivity.
Because that goes back to there is the air of I'm right, you're wrong, or that there is a right sexuality and a wrong sexuality. And if your partner, kind of going back to the thought of like how couples deal with this, is I often think it's an absolute miracle that people can get sexually connected and stay sexually connected and be happy about it, because our society doesn't support that. And it's really important that if you want to be in a relationship that is supportive and sex positive for your sexuality, then you have to also be somebody who is supportive and safe for your partner or partners to be who they are sexually towards you too. And that isn't always easy. And that doesn't mean you say yes and accept absolutely everything that you want to do just because your partner or partners want to do it. It means that you don't judge them and you don't shame them. And there's two favorite noises that I have. One is the sound of pleasure, and the second is, like just the way, like being curious about any kind of differences or anything that feels new to you makes such a big difference of not shutting down somebody. And it's one of the most harmful things you can do to a partner or a friend, a family member, a child, is if they've making the risk to tell you something that's opened up about who they are sexually to you, and you shame or judge them, you've done an incredible amount of harm. And I consider that part of sexual violence.
Yeah, and I agree with that point of view. It is tantamount to a form of sexual violence, because you've shamed them, you've made them feel as though they are less of a human being because they feel a certain way, or because they have a certain proclivity or experience sex differently, different types of practices. So I totally agree with that. And that brings me to the two topics. One is going to be more of a contentious topic, which is sex education. And we've had this conversation in the past.
I have feelings.
So the one topic is raising, and I'll say young adults, because when I say children, there may be some folks listening in that would be offended, because what is the right age? And I think that there's a question mark. What I believe may not be, and what you believe may be different. So I don't want to offend anyone. However, we do need to think about how we educate generations of young men and women who identify as men and women and others, right? As to sex positivity, to create generations of human beings that are sex positive. And then the other topic is around counseling. So we talked about those individuals that may not have the luxury of seeing someone like yourself, but for those that do and want to pursue this type of counseling, it's really finding somebody that you feel comfortable with, because let's face it, even though you are a psychologist, you may not be a psychologist that understands sex positivity, because you come with your own biases. So we'll start with that one, since it's less thorny, if you will. How do you find someone that matches up with what you are seeking in terms of improving your communication, especially as it pertains to sex positivity? Are there some recommendations?
Yes, and you know how I feel about this, that in my profession and those that are similar, there's several different kind of titles in the helping profession in the mental health world. But the majority of them do not require one class about sexuality or any kind of training in sexuality to become licensed. This is terrible. It is troubling. It is just shocking that that is the case. And I've been advocating for years for that to change. And it's a hard thing to make happen and to come to fruition. So do not assume that anyone in the mental health field does have an area of expertise to begin with, like that's the case. Because they haven't been trained, including myself. I only had one class and I had to fight for that and find that in my schedule to get that. And everything else I had to learn on my own and find my own training and my own expertise outside of an institution for it. There are people who are under sex therapy. There are other people who go under sexology as well. That there are degrees that are absolutely sex forward in it, but in general, they're not. So one, don't make the assumption. And then next is ask somebody. And the question that I like to ask is, I'm curious about your training within the topic of sexuality. If you know what you are looking for in particular about within the world and topic of sexuality, you can ask specifically about their training in that topic and their belief system in that topic. But sometimes we don't know exactly what we're asking, and sometimes we don't know exactly what we're looking for. So I would also ask, how much of your practice is devoted in your clients? Does the topic of sexuality come into it, sex or sexuality, and how they answer? Number one, their comfort level that you perceive is an important indicator, and then actually what they're answering to. And you want to have someone that sounds comfortable with the topic. They're not surprised that you're asking it. And two, that the answer that they give you feels from a place of comfort because they're used to being asked it, or they know the answer themselves. I also think that if they have a website, if they are on social media in any way, through a Facebook page or their website or TikTok, Instagram, check it out and see if you're seeing anything that has to do with sexuality anywhere. If it's in their bio, if they have a flag, inclusive flag, if they have any posts that are about it. Now, one caveat I have to that is we are highly censored on social media platforms to say the word sex or anything that has to do with any kind of in that. So sometimes people shy away from it, so they're not having their accounts taken down, or they're not having any kind of censorship in it. So it doesn't always mean that. But if you see someone who is doing it, then you know too that they are most likely going to have an inclusive attitude. And then if they offer consults, it would be what I would ask in the consult. I would ask those questions, just like I do for physicians. I would say, like, how much do you care about my sexual health? That's a question that I ask. How comfortable are you prioritizing my sexual health? I ask that of providers. It's one of those places. How comfortable do you feel about speaking about my sexual life or about this particular topic? And trust your instinct on that.
It's, I think I've shared this with you in the past, but I was actually going to use the example of even when I speak to a new practitioner, whether that's a gynecologist or a primary care practitioner, I used anatomically correct terms. And if someone says, are you having any issues down there? That's a big red flag that indicates that if they are uncomfortable as a healthcare practitioner using the word vagina or vulva or breast or nipple or what have you, then that probably means they're going to be really uptight about asking questions about sexual health and sexual wellness. So I would imagine that you could also test those waters in the consultation if you introduce the concept of sexuality, sexual health, how comfortable are they discussing, issues around sexual wellness. And if you get the body language, which is closed body language, remember the closed body language and the shifting in the chair. And of course, there are some other obvious signs like the woman that looked down. She was a gynecologist and she wanted to know whether I had a problem talking about all these things down there all day. So there's nothing on my floor.
Yeah.
There's nothing on my floor that I'm uncomfortable discussing.
Well, and we've talked about this. I love those. I don't love the stories that happen, but I know the importance of the stories that you're sharing. And again, like the medical community too hasn't been trained. It's just been off limits topics, and in the professions that we are putting our trust in most. So be an advocate for yourself with that, and listen to your intuition. And I actually, literally today, had a client tell me a story. She'd been working with a therapist for a couple of years, and her husband were moving into a place in their sexual life, and were seeking support and like opinions about what to do about this new behavior that they were going to be embarking on. And the therapist said, "I just think that's wrong," and that is an indication that there's your time with that person is done. If someone is telling you what you're doing is wrong when you are in the exploration phase, or you are not saying that it's wrong for yourself, then leave. And I would recommend that highly, that you shouldn't do the work of helping someone become inclusive and open.
There was there was an interesting article. It was directed at psychologists, called Sex Positivity and Counseling Psychology. And it was actually an introduction to sex positivity. Of course, I read it because I wanted to prepare for our discussion today, but it was interesting in the way that they described how counselors in counseling psychology ought to approach different types of sexual proclivities, and how they can reframe their thinking so as not to become judgmental. One of the examples that they used was BDSM, and some of the practices that individuals who are into those types of behaviors may approach a psychologist, a counseling psychologist. And I thought that was fascinating, that someone who was in the practice of psychology would have that sort of judgmental attitude. But again, we're humans.
A
So
human
we
who
come,
haven't been properly sex educated.
we come with the baggage. So it's important that if somebody that you're seeing comes with that sort of baggage, it's probably not a good match.
Mhm. And I would ask about the competencies. What is your competency? What is your knowledge base? What is your training? What's your comfort level in speaking about this? Because I need this to be a safe place for me to explore, and for me to find out what feels right for me and what doesn't. Is this something that you've done? Is this something that you feel comfortable with? And we are bound in our ethical code to refer and to say when we have reached a bias or out of our scope of practice. And unfortunately, most of our mental health field sexuality is out of the scope of practice. And for me, I think it's a huge part of almost everything that we're encountering. Even when someone's coming to you about talking about anxiety, if they're on anxiety medicine, the medicine could have side effects that affect your sexuality and your relationship with your body. And so if we're not able to speak about, this could make you have a difficulty having an erection, or this could change your desire to be sexually connecting at all. If that can't happen, even though you may not presenting to the therapy session with a sexual need, you need to be able to feel comfortable with that topic, and you need someone that can say that to you and speak about it, and mourn and have empathy and make it matter.
On the intake form, if you're visiting a psychologist or a psychiatrist, on the intake form, that could also be a big red flag, or it could be something that is encouraging. So if there is some information that this professional is seeking about your sexual health and wellness and your sexual activity, I would think that would be a good sign.
Yes. Yeah. And I don't want to come off as very negative about even my own profession, because there are so many people who have done the extra work on themselves, their own sexuality, and have sought out extra training and certification. And there are some programs that are directly focused on sexual matters that are doing great work in the world. So we're out there. And don't settle for less, because your sexuality matters. And being surrounded by people in your personal life, and for the professionals that you're seeking to support, we should be surrounded by positivity.
So the last topic, and we have a few minutes to discuss the last topic, which is the next generation. and where does that belong? And this, again, there's probably some debate. So where does that belong? Does it belong at home? Does it belong in the school system? Does it belong in both? And what are the things that we can do that help the next generation to feel more comfortable in their sexuality and to become more sex positive?
Mm-hmm. I wish that sex positivity was more in the forefront of this controversial discussion than should sex education be here or not. Like I so appreciate the way you framed the question, and obviously, like it's so polarizing. And so I acknowledge that what I'm about to say isn't going to fit for everyone's values and opinions. But research has shown for the people and communities and cultures that have access to sex positive education that there are fewer sexual violence incidences, there are fewer unwanted pregnancies, and that they even think, although this isn't a complete correlation yet, there's like musings and hypothesis that it also means that relationships are lasting longer and they're more fulfilling. And what is negative about that? To me, it doesn't add up. If you're seeing those in other countries and other cultures, or the communities that have taken charge in this way of making it sex positive does not equal lots and lots of sex. It doesn't. And in fact, the course that I teach revealed what I actually found, especially when I was doing it at a college campus, was that those that had access to the concept of sexual agency, which means that you have a right to say yes or no beyond sexual violence, but you get to check in with what your sexuality is on your own terms. You just need to do it with purpose and intention and knowing who you are. For those who have access to that skill set, their yeses often became so much more powerful. They didn't mean that they were more frequent. And in fact, a lot of them were saying no a whole lot more often and feeling good about that. Having the ability and the words and the confirmation and validation that they can say no. That is the come from of sex positivity. And I wish we were teaching a lot more about consent. I wish we were teaching a whole lot more about pleasure. I wish we were teaching a whole lot more about agency in our sex positive curriculum at all ages. I wish we were teaching kids at very young ages how to make decisions for themselves outside of sexual connection, because we have found that when an individual knows how to make a decision, then that changes a whole lot of how they're experiencing the world, and that they're making better decisions that are based in their soul and things that are aligned for them. You put that into sexual context, and we are also doing so much more healing and so much less trauma is happening. And why does that have to be outside of a sexual positive curriculum? I think it should be a huge part of it. How are you making this decision? And I know that there's a variance of that children have the ability to make decisions for themselves, and they haven't fully formed their brains or frontal lobe. And I understand that. And I have a 23-year-old son, and I have seen poor decisions that have been made. So I get it. And I was there myself, and I have a list of poor decisions too. So I get it. We can't prevent them from doing all of this, but we can arm them with the skill of that. And one of the best things that I think is a part of parenting advice that I give everyone inside and outside of the concept and thought of sexuality is teach your kids how to make decisions, which is living with the consequences too of their decisions, and teach your kids that you trust them, that they have good judgment. And if their judgment or if their decisions have gone awry, that they can figure out how to be okay, and that you can support them in that. That will translate to a very different sexual experience in their life, no matter what gender they are. And that's sex positive to me. And that should be happening in classrooms, in schools, and it should be happening in your private life too. But we also are dealing with people who weren't given that experience too. So you have to work on yourself and your journey, and you have to work with, if you are influencing children of any age, work with them also. And I'll say this last thing, so here I am, this is something that I am an expert in, that I've done a lot of studying in and speak to people all over the world about. So I have a lot of information. I even have had times that I sat there, asked my plant, what do I say back to this? You just don't know. There's a rule book and there's not a rule book about how to be a sex positive person when you're influencing other kids, whether they're your own or other kids in your life. And so I think also you have to give yourself the room to come back to any answer that you've given or any response that you've shown them or modeled that you didn't get it completely right, and you come back to it. Again, I think that's another beautiful thing to give people the education, whether it's inside or outside of sexual connection, is sometimes you don't always get it right the first time. So have the room to go back and say it again or do it differently. And sometimes if the decision's already been made in your sexual life, then what the work is how do you make meaning of it? And how you make meaning of your sexual decisions and who you are as a sexual being is really potent and important. And I think it should also be a part of our sex positive education.
I couldn't agree with you more. It's always fascinating. It's always a pleasure to have the opportunity to have you as our guest. I learned so much from you over these many months that we've been working together. And I hope that our listeners and viewers have felt the same way. But if you want more, you should visit drjuliana.com. Dr. Juliana.
It's actually Dr. Dash, because Dr. Juliana is in Romania and she's a dentist.
Right.
It's okay, yes.
Thank you, drjuliana.com. And Dr. Juliana is in Kentucky. So if you happen to live in the area, you may visit her in person, but there's always telehealth, and I'm sure she would be more than happy to do a consult virtually. So I'll encourage all of you that are looking for someone with her expertise and or that want to become more of an expert in this area to reach out to Dr. Juliana. And as always, it has been just a pleasure to have you as our guest. We thank you. We are very grateful. And to those that took the time to listen in this evening or this morning or midday, depending upon where you are viewing, we thank you for your participation, and please stay tuned for more of the Love Mia Vita podcast, for more webinars. All of this brought to you by FemPharma Consumer Healthcare. Dr. Juliana, thank you. Be well. And to our listeners and viewers, please stay well, take care of yourself, and take care of each other. Thank you.